Hello there, and welcome back to Daddy Rolled a One. I'm Martin, and this is another in my series of videos on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons, and one of the companies that published them, Tactical Studies Rules, and its later descendant company, TSR Hobbies. Today we're going to be talking about what is usually considered among old school players that were around at the time when this book came out as the most polarizing and might even call it controversial book that came out in the advanced Dungeons and Dragons line. And we're going to go into why that's the case. Before we get started, I'd like to ask that if you enjoy this video, please give it a like. And most importantly, if you could please subscribe to my channel. Little channels like me are built on getting new subscribers. That's how YouTube knows that people want to recommend their content to other people. And the other thing I wanted to do here is I've been blogging since 2011. So it's been over 12 years now. And one of the things that I do in my post whenever I blog is talk about where I am at the time, which I am right now in my home office at my credenza, which is to the right of my desk over near a window here. And I talk about what I'm drinking and what I'm listening to. So I thought I would try that in this video just to see if you guys like it. So you have to let me know in the comments, is this something that you like? Is this something that you really don't like? Or are you just completely ambivalent and don't care one way or the other? And if you do like it, let me know if you want me to continue, if I should keep it at the front of the video or at the end. But really quickly, I thought I would talk about what I was drinking while I was working on my notes for this video, which is this Russian Imperial Stout by Stone Brewing Company. It's called Mikhail. This is the Stone Totalitarian Russian Imperial Stout, aged in bourbon barrels with espresso beans. And this is from 2018. I've had it in my wine refrigerator, just mellowing out. And I thought I would open it because it is a dreary, cloudy day here yet again. It's like week 3 in Southern California, very uncharacteristic for this time of year. So I kind of wanted just a little pick me up. So I poured just a small 3-ounce pour in this little snifter here, and very vanilla from the barrel aging, very coffee forward, a little bit of chocolate. Anyway, it's just kind of like a nice little, like I said, like a little pick me up. Music-wise, I was listening to this earlier while I took my notes for this. This is Miles Davis' Star People. This is from a record club I belong to called VMP, or Vinyl Be Pleased. This came out originally in 1983 after Miles Davis had like a 6-year period where he didn't record any new music. He got back together with one of his classic arrangers, Gil Evans, who had worked with him on some classic records like Miles Davis' Sketches of Spain, also Porgy and Bess. And so this is returned to working with that arranger, but with this late period Miles jazz fusion type of music, which I've kind of been getting into more lately. So anyway, that's that. Let's talk about this book. Why is this book so polarizing? Really quickly, I'm going to go into first the construction, the physical construction of the book. A lot of people are very upset about. It starts to really, it creates a new ability score that's completely useless and unnecessary. It deals with ability score inflation. It's really the start of that to where we get to where we are now, where characters are considered to be not effective unless they have like an 18 or a 20 and a few different ability scores. That didn't used to be the case. It has some new classes in here that are not super balanced compared to classes that had come previously. And those are kind of like the core areas that I'm going to be talking about. Now, at the time when this book came out, I actually liked it quite a bit. Some parts more than others. And over the years, like I use stuff from this book, so I'm not one who hates this book. So I should mention those things that I were just saying are what are very polarizing, or sometimes people will call it controversial. They don't bother me as much, but that's kind of like the prevailing theory among old school gamers who were alive when this book came out, or who were gaming when this book came out, I should say. So this was a book that was released in 1985. It's part of the Orange series in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So I have talked before about all 18 books that came out in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons line for first edition. There's a link to that video here. This book came out after 2 years of having no new books coming out. So this comes out in 1985. The last new books that were released were revised covers for the core books in 1983 and a new book in 1983, which was the Monster Manual 2. So it's been 2 years. Also in 1983, TSR sees the kind of its peak of sales at that point. So the sales had never been higher. However, they did miss their forecast. They had a very aggressive forecast. So even though they saw the highest amount of sales that they'd seen, they didn't hit that forecast number. Also in 1983, Gary Gygax at this point has left Lake Geneva, where TSR was headquartered, and gone to set up a new division called TSR Entertainment in California, where he's working to try to get a D&D movie made. In 1982, he writes in his review of the Conan the Barbarian movie, he writes in Dragon Magazine that the D&D movie should be coming out in 1984 and 1985. That never happens. However, he does get a cartoon made on CBS that runs for 3 seasons, but that's really all that comes of his time there. So 1984 happens. Sales, I think, if I remember correctly, are like less than half of what they'd been in 1983. And so the company is in a panic because they had been on just tremendous growth year over year after year. And this is their first year where they're seeing sales just not do very, very well. And so they're panicking, and they start to go through massive amounts of layoffs in 1984, 1985. Now, one of the theories of why this happened is because they were making most of their money by new players coming into the game and buying the core rule books for Advanced D&D or the box sets for Dungeons and Dragons, or what we now call basic D&D. However, by this point in time, most people who were going to be coming into the game had already done so. So now they're not selling the things that make them the most money. What they're selling are supplements and adventures, which first usually have a more limited audience because they're only being sold to dungeon masters and not players. So the pool of people that's going to buy those is smaller. And then also they make less money off of those because they're smaller books and they cost less. They cost less to make, but they also cost less at the store, so there's less of a markup, so they make less money, and they're selling fewer units of them because they're selling them to a smaller pool of people. So Gary Gygax later, much later, decades after, his recounting of this is that he's in California. He has no idea that the company is being mismanaged like this. And so he has to return from California to right the ship and get everything back on track. Again, his version of the story, it's one version. But he says that in March of 1985, he writes an article in Dragon Magazine where he says that he's going to be putting out this book late summer of 1985. And it's going to have all this new content in it that is coming from articles that he has written, for the most part, in Dragon Magazine. So a lot of the content that is in this book, the vast majority of the content that's in this book, had already been published as articles in Dragon Magazine or in Imagine Magazine, which was a gaming magazine in England that tended to either repurpose stuff that had been in Dragon, or sometimes it had its new content as well. And but that's where the content's coming from. So the reason that happened was because that was the quickest way that they could get a hardback book out, because Gary didn't have to sit down and write it from scratch. It's already been, for the most part, done. Okay, so that's why this book exists. So the construction of the book is very typical of the time. Mine is in actually pretty good shape because I do take very, very good care of my books. However, the other book that I purchased in 1985, which is Oriental Adventures, comes out a few months after this. The binding on that one is completely falling apart. The glue is dried. The whole sections of pages are falling out, which is a lot of things of what people complain about with this particular book. Mine just happens to not have had that happen, but it's very, very common, which is a very common complaint about this book. And just printing at TSR in general during this time period, they were taking shortcuts. All right, so the book is divided into 2 sections, a player section and a DM section, because again, as you know from my video on the Dungeon Master's Guide, Gary felt that there were parts of the game that players should not be aware of. So his thinking was, if you bought this book and you were a player, you would stop reading when you got to this section because you weren't supposed to read this. Good luck with that. All right, so right off the bat, we have one of the most controversial parts of this book, the creation of a new ability score, Comeliness, which reflects physical attractiveness, social grace, and personal beauty. I mean, that's just going to be a problem right out the gate. So you already have charisma. Obviously, charisma isn't about physical beauty. They restate that so many times that it's not about that. It's about your overall presence and how people think of you and how well you are at communicating and all that kind of thing. And that's fine. However, this score of physical beauty ends up being like, it's related to charisma. If your charisma is high, you get a bonus to your comeliness. So it was pointless. You didn't need a score like this. I don't really think people were asking for it. However, comeliness has been in the game for a really long time. It was in articles back in Dragon Magazine. Dave Arneson had it as an ability score in his Blackmore game. He also had an ability score called sex. So, and again, it was an ability score. So that's not to say it was great. I'm just saying it was part of the game. He included it in his first fantasy campaign supplement by Judges Guild in 1977. So the score has been around for a while. I've seen reviews of the Oriental Adventures book, which came out after this, that includes Comeliness, and people saying like, why did Gary put Comeliness in the Oriental Adventures book? It has like, why did he create that score just for this book? He didn't. It was in here first. I don't like the score. We didn't hardly use it back in the day, even after this book came out. But my point is, it debuted before Oriental Adventures. It has nothing to do with being solely in that book just because it was Oriental Adventures. All right, so that's the thing that people complain about in this book. And part of it also is related to a concept we're going to get to next, which is ability score inflation. People don't want to play ugly characters, and the descriptions here are not flattering. You could have a negative 16 or lower comeliness, which means that people view you when they're repulsed or horrified. What? Like, nobody wants to play a character like that. Or I wouldn't think so. I mean, you could have some role players out there that get into it, but for the most part, you want to have a high comeliness because you want people to think you're attractive. You're playing a role-playing game. You don't want to spend the whole game with people reacting to you like you're ugly, right? So the other thing in this game is that Gary Gygax expands the options for non-human characters as far as what class that they can be. In the original game, for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, newer players might not know this, there were limits to which class or which race could be which class. We now call them species, but I'm going to use race because that's what they use here. Which race could be which class, and how far that they could advance in that class. So if you were a dwarf fighter, you could get as high as maybe 6th or 7th level. I forget what the level was at the time, but that was it. And that was Gary's balance to the fact that non-human characters started with this suite of abilities that are front-loaded. You get them all at first level. They're not level-based. And so right out the gate at first level, for the most part, non-human characters are better than human characters. And so Gary's balance to that was that humans can be any class and they can advance as far as they want. They have unlimited advancement, whereas non-humans have a smaller pool of classes they can pick from, and they're limited to the level that they can reach. That was the way that he balanced it. So people really didn't like that. They complained a lot about it. There were tons of letters written into Dragon Magazine. So Gary's solution to that was to first add more subspecies. So there's new races in here, but they're all just subspecies. That he adds gray dwarves. He adds dark elves. This is the first time you can play a dark elf. This book is the first time you can play a dark elf as a player character. He adds valley elves and wild elves. He adds deep gnomes or Svirfneblin. So those are added. And then he also expands the opportunities for what those classes can be. So in the past, dwarves couldn't be cleric as a player character. They could be NPC clerics, but not player characters. But now you see every class here can be a cleric. And that's related to another part in the back of this book. All right. However, ability score inflation, we talked about that. So let's really quickly look at the half-elf ranger. A half-elf ranger can reach 9th level if they have a strength of 18 and 90%. So one of the things that Advanced D&D had was if you were a fighter type character, which included rangers, paladins, if you got an 18, if you rolled an 18 naturally, then you could roll percentile dice to increase your score. So it didn't go from an 18 to a 19, it went to an 18, 53% or whatever. So in this particular case, if you 18 and you happen to roll 90, you could go up to 9th level as a ranger. However, let's look at that footnote. You also had to have intelligence 18, wisdom 18, and constitution 18. So you had to have 4 ability scores that were 18. And then you had to roll percentile dice on your strength to get a 90. And if you got all of that, you could go to 9th level. So this is one of the books where people start to kind of make this distinction between adventurers, having characters that are just out to kind of find some gold and try to make their way through life, versus heroes. Because if you have to have a character that has to have 18s in 4 different ability scores, you're a hero right out the gate. You've done something extraordinary in your life to be at that level. And every non-human race in here has some kind of limitation like that in order to advance higher in their class. And so Nowadays in 5th edition, if you think about it, when's the last time you saw a 5th edition character that didn't have an 18 or maybe even a 20 in the ability score that was the most closely tied to their class? So a strength for fighter or intelligence for wizard. It just doesn't happen. Nobody has a character that has like a 14 in that ability score, because the thought is, well, you won't be effective. You're not going to get those bonuses, right? And in previous editions of D&D, that wasn't really as much of the thing, because the bonuses were very minimal behind your ability scores. So that's one thing people complain about in this book, is that it started this proliferation of the increasing of ability scores, the artificial inflation of ability scores. All right, there are 3 new classes that debut in this book, and they are the Cavalier, which first came out in Dragon Magazine number 72, which was the second issue of Dragon that I had ever seen. It was the first time I realized that Gary was creating new content that was official for the game. And the Cavalier class, very polarizing. Let's talk about why. You had to roll on a table to get to your social class. And if you rolled your social class being too low, if you weren't of lower upper class or something like that, then you had to start as a 0 level character. And you could start with even 2 different levels of playing a 0 level character where you are not very effective before you even get to start as a 1st level character. No other class in the game does this. It's like the Cavalier's kind of playing its own game that's separate from what everyone else is doing, right? All based on these social contracts. There's things in here about who you have to attack in combat first, and it's all role playing, but it's like very clear. Like, you have to attack these sorts of enemies, what kind of armor you can wear. You can wear any armor, but you won't wear lower class armor, so you won't wear leather or padded, even if that's all that's available, because you think it's beneath your station. And if there's plate armor available, even if you have magical chainmail that gives you a better bonus, you won't wear it because plate mail is of a higher station. It's just so goofy. And then this is the only class in the game that gets to undergo training in between adventures to increase their ability scores. So all their physical ability scores, strength, dexterity, con, they get to increase them in between levels. No other class does that. What does that have to do with being good at mounted combat? Which, by the way, they are very good, and they get to increase their bonuses level by level by level that other classes don't get to do. So this is kind of the start of like, well, why would you just play a simple fighter when you get this guy and you get all these extra goodies, right? It just doesn't seem very balanced. It's one of the things people complain about. Now, that said, I love these when they came out. I love the idea of knights on horseback and armor. I got into the game coincidentally by reading stories about King Arthur and King Arthur mythology, and friends seeing that and asking me to play a game of D&D with them. So I have an affinity for this class, even though I understand why people don't like it. Okay, other classes in this book. The Barbarian debuted in Dragon number 63. It is then repeated here. So the main things that people don't like about this class, so it wasn't a core class. This is the first appearance of the Barbarian, which is now just part of the game. Like in 5th edition, it's just right in the player's handbook, but it hadn't been until this book came out. And so some of the things that people don't like about this, one is that the theme of the class is like part Conan, but then also part historical barbarians, and they don't quite really match together very well. And then the other thing is that this class is also kind of playing its own game because they won't associate with magic users or use magic items, and they will destroy magic items. So if you find them, you better keep them away from the Barbarian because he is going to destroy it because he finds magic to be, evil. And so, how is this guy going to adventure in a class that's probably going to have a magic user, right? And so it just doesn't really work. It's like a lot of role-playing restrictions, and those were put into place because he gets a lot of abilities that fighters don't get. And so if you don't use those role-playing restrictions, then you're basically just handing for free a character that's better than a lot of other people in the game. They've got higher hit dice at 12, and they just get a lot of extra abilities. So people didn't like that. Then the last new thing that's introduced in here is a split class, the Thief-Acrobat. So this class debuted in Dragon Magazine number 69. And this class is the idea is that you're going to operate as a thief until you get to a certain level, and then you're going to switch to become an acrobat. It's fine. There's nothing really unbalanced about it. However, I don't know that it was really necessary. I think that these abilities could have just been tacked onto the thief rather than making a whole new class. So that's kind of it for the player section. You have a brand new section of weapons here, but the biggest part of this section is spells. So, and the spells are for the most part fine. There's nothing wrong with them. So, but this is also where you get the debut of cantrips, 0-level spells, had never been part of the game before for magic users and for illusionists. Okay, so then you get to Unearthed Arcana, Dungeon Master's Guide section. So the main part here, it's mostly treasure stuff. I mean, there's a few articles on, adjudicating stuff. Different treasures and things like that. Different effects of like combat, effects of darkness. Here's those social class tables where you roll to see what your social class is. And then you get to the end here. After all the treasures, there are some new appendices. So, I'm a fan of appendices if you watch my video on the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. So weaponless combat, which had never been detailed in the game before. So this is how you have combat without weapons. And then non-lethal combat and multiple different types, 3 different kinds. Then a section on non-human deities. These are all coming out of articles written in Dragon Magazine by Roger Moore on the non-human races. And so these are now core to the game, but they debuted in this book after they had been published in Dragon Magazine. And then you have this whole section at the end on polearms. Gary loves his polearms. And so there's this whole section here on different types of polearms. This was originally published as an article in the Strategic Review in 1975. And they brought it all the way back 10 years later and put it in this book. Okay, so let's talk about some other things people don't like about this book. It is riddled with errors, not so much grammatical and typographical, but game mechanics and things that they contradict each other. It just doesn't make sense, to the point where they had to publish multiple articles in Dragon Magazine to correct it. It's like errata. They never reprint this book with the errata in it. It's always wrong. So if you didn't get those articles in Dragon Magazine, things in here were going to be confusing. Pages and pages of articles and errata written in Dragon Magazine to correct the errors that were made in this book, which is another reason why people don't like it. It was definitely rushed to get this out, to get sales increased. So that's a quick look at the history of, again, one of the most polarizing books in Dungeons & Dragons history, Unearthed Arcana. So please comment below. Let me know what you think about this book. Did you like it? Do you not like it? What did you like or not like about it? Comment below. Also below, you'll see where you can buy a t-shirt to support my channel. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for watching this video. Happy gaming, stay safe, and I'll talk to you next time.